This Poor Man's Hangar Tour series covers the evolution of U.S. designed and built heavy aircraft piston engines and the aircraft they powered. From the 1920s through the 1950s, these U.S. designed and built engines were dominant with a worldwide competitive advantage, which is certainly no longer the case in the modern aviation world. We cover primarily the heavy piston radial designs from the lowest horsepower engines of the late 1920s to the highest horsepower engines in the 1950s at the dawn of the jet age. These engines range from smaller 7- and 9-cylinder engines in the 450 to 800 horsepower range to the largest 18- and 28-cylinder engines in the 2,000 to 3,800 horsepower range as our episodes unfold. So far, through episode 4, we've covered engines up through the 14-cylinder 1,450 horsepower Pratt & Whitney twin Wasp D, which was best known as power for the Douglas DC-4 or military C-54, which can be considered a design that represented the dimensional springboard for today's airliners and military transports beyond the DC-3's meager dimensions. Hi, John Reed, Aerodinosaur. For some of you who may not be familiar with the radial engine nomenclature, R stands for radial, and the number following it represents the approximate cubic inch displacement of the engine. You'll recall in episode 2 we covered the 9-cylinder Curtiss-Wright R-1820 developing up to 1,200 horsepower during World War II for aircraft such as the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress and many of the Douglas DC-3 or military C-47 transports under various designations. For convenience, I'll call this World War II engine the baseline World War II engine, which, by the way, has seen extensive post-war service as well, especially in DC-3s. And we'll use the DC-3 generic term for the military C-47 as well for simplicity. But in this episode 5, we're going to look at an advanced post-war version of this engine known as the 9 Series R-1820 that developed up to 1,575 horsepower, but also commonly produced in lower 1,425 and 1,475 horsepower versions. Among several other aircraft we'll cover in the next episode, the 9 Series powered post-war transports such as the Grumman HU-16 Albatross amphibian and the hybrid C-117D Super DC-3S Skytrain, along with an odd and largely unknown DC-4 variant that used this engine. The other aircraft that were powered by the 9 Series engine involved a number of smaller military aircraft which, as I mentioned, we'll cover in the next episode 6. These include the North American T-28 Trojan, the Grumman S-2 Tracker and E-1 Tracer, and the Sikorsky H-34 Choctaw helicopter. The R-1829 series post-war design advancements, which we'll cover in a moment, allowed a 27% increase in maximum power from the same displacement as the baseline World War II R-1820. It's also important to note that these design improvements characterized all Pratt & Whitney and Curtiss-Wright post-war heavy radial engines manufactured through the 1950s. Also, the term Cyclone 9 series was typical of Curtiss-Wright's post-war nomenclature. For instance, its 7-cylinder R-1300 was called the Cyclone 7 series, and its 18-cylinder R-3350 was known as the Cyclone 18 series. So let's look at some of the technical improvements in the morphing of this baseline R-1820 into the improved post-war 9 series version of the R-1820. We'll also address the fact that some pilots who experienced the 9 series might take issue with that statement, so it truly depends on what you mean by improvement. Let's check out the visual differences between the 1,200 horsepower baseline wartime engine on the left and the 9 Series post-war engine on the right, especially the cylinder heads comprising the upper half of each jug. While the 9 Series is a major redesign, the largest difference was the cylinder heads. The World War II baseline engine features integrally cast cylinder heads and cooling fins, as were all early World War II engines, including the Curtiss-Wright R-2600 that powered the North American B-25 Mitchell, among others, the Pratt & Whitney R-2800 double Wasp that powered the Vought F4U-1 Corsair, among others, and the Curtiss-Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone that powered the Boeing B-29 Superfortress. On the other hand, the Postwar 9 series heads on the right are forged with the cooling fins then cut into the forging, as it was with all larger heavy radial engines manufactured in the postwar era. Briefly, a cast head uses completely melted aluminum where the molecules are fully separated and poured as a liquid into a complex fine mold. On the other hand, a forged head requires less heat where the molecules are not separated but just loosened in place, so to speak, giving the aluminum a gummy consistency at temperature. This hot piece of aluminum gum is then stamped into a simple rough mold, retaining the molecular lattice of the metal, providing more strength and integrity compared to a cast cylinder. This allows more horsepower to be produced, which is further enhanced by the ability to cut more cooling fins into the head, allowing for more efficient cylinder cooling. Now, let's take a closer look at the respective cylinder heads. I just said that more fins were cut into the forged head on the right than would be possible to mold into the cast head on the left. But it looks like the wartime cast head has more fins than the post-war forged head. However, that is an illusion because between each of those wider spaced fins on the 9 series engine, there's a smaller diameter fin that you can't see in the photo, meaning there are approximately twice the number of fins on the front of the forged head than you can actually see. Notice that on the back of the head, the fins all revert to the same diameter. Since these are the largest cylinders used in radial engine production, they generated geometrically more heat per usable horsepower than any radial engine, so this fin pattern allegedly helps make the cooling air action more efficient. I'd also like to point out that all R-1820s had the same 6.125-inch standard cylinder bore as all 14-cylinder Wright R-2600s that powered the B-25, for example, and all 18-cylinder Wright R-3350s that powered the B-29s, A-1 Sky Raiders, Super Constellations, and the DC-7s, for example. The post-war R-3350 fins were usually cut in a similar manner as the 9 series R-1820s, though the R-3350 fin diameters were much greater, as we will show in a minute. Now let's turn to the Pratt & Whitney post-war engines with forged heads, namely the 18-cylinder R-2800C series cylinder shown on the left and the 28-cylinder R-4360 on the right. These powered later Corsairs, among other post-war fighters, as well as large post-war airliners and military transports, for example. Each large Pratt & Whitney cylinder shown here had a smaller 5.75-inch standard bore than the 6.125 bore Wright used, but it used the same diameter fins cut into the forging front and back. Still, some post-war R-3350 heads were also cut in a constant diameter manner similar to the post-war Pratt & Whitney engines. As you can gather, the heavy piston radial era was the era of trial and error, not computer simulations. Starting with the R-2800C series late in World War II, the post-war big radials featured many other subtle changes in design and metallurgy compared to the wartime engines, including improvements in first and second order vibration dampening, full employment of stellite-faced sodium-cooled exhaust valves. But as just covered, the biggest factor was the switch from integrally cast heads and cooling fins to forged heads with machine-cut fins. With the R-1820, this turned a 1,200 horsepower engine into an engine developing up to 1,575 horsepower, more power than the widely used 14-cylinder Pratt & Whitney R-2000 of 1,450 horsepower. It cannot be overemphasized that this was the most horsepower ever pulled out of a widely produced 9-cylinder aircraft engine, which caused a few problems with the 9 series engines rated at that level, as we will discuss in more detail. This table summarizes the power differences between wartime and post-World War II heavy piston radial engines. The single variable considered is cast versus forged head. Other incremental variables are not considered. You see here that three engines, the R-1830, the R-2000, and the R-2600, all originated within the depths of World War II with cast heads and were not materially improved in the post-war era. Likewise, three of the engines, the R-1820, the R-2800, and R-3350, started with cast heads during World War II and were re-engineered with forged and cut heads starting late in the war, which, as I have repeatedly mentioned, it became state-of-the-art in the post-war era. And one engine, the R-4360, which began production late in the war, was never produced with cast heads. The takeaway here is that the original three World War II wartime engines that were re-engineered could produce around a range of about 25 to 30% more in maximum horsepower in their final refinements during the post-war years. I've placed asterisks in the R-3350 column, so before someone yells at me about the post-war R-3350 developing only 2,800 horsepower, please note that starting in the early 1950s, the turbo compound version of the R-3350 would soon develop up to 3,700 horsepower. But that additional power wasn't directly from the cylinders or cylinder boost, and therefore had little to do with cylinder design. Instead, with the turbo compound, horsepower ratings ranged from 3,250 horsepower in the earlier Lockheed Super Constellations and Douglas DC-7s to 3,700 horsepower in the Navy P-2V7 Neptunes and SP-5B Marlin seaplanes. With turbo compounding, normally wasted exhaust energy was channeled through three power recovery turbines, or PRTs, adding power by shafting that exhaust-driven turbine energy through fluid couplings directly back into the crankshaft. Therefore, the extra energy did not come from enhanced cylinder pressures, as is the case with the generic exhaust-driven turbocharger. Accordingly, the power recovery turbines increased the power of a 2,800 horsepower core engine by up to 32% or 20% at cruise altitude without added stress on the cylinders or cylinder cooling. Despite the major increase in horsepower, the 9 Series R-1820 found only one limited application in a large 4-engine transport, but was used mainly in smaller single-engine advanced military trainers, early helicopters, and smaller carrier-borne twin-engine anti-submarine warfare and airborne early warning aircraft. We'll discuss these smaller applications in the next episode 6, but today we'll focus on the most widely utilized larger aircraft it powered, the Grumman HU-16 Albatross amphibian and the C-117 Super DC-3, approximately 100 of which were manufactured from surplus stock C-47s and DC-3s. As far as large 4-engine transports go, there is that minor exception I mentioned here and in the previous episode 4. In the late 1940s, Chicago and Southern Airlines took delivery of 5 DC-4s that were manufactured with 1,425 horsepower 9 Series R-1820s, a DC-4 version where information and photos are unfortunately extremely scarce. I don't think these aircraft were retained by the airline beyond the early 1950s, but I have no definitive acquisition or disposition dates or information on how they were disposed of, other than most likely being converted back to the standard DC-4s with standard R-2000s for operational continuity. Other than this extremely poor, touched-up rendition of the plane, other photos of this mostly unknown variant seem impossible to find. The 9 Series powered DC-4 was called the Dixie Liner and was touted as slightly faster than the standard DC-4. Because the 9 Series engine was 400 pounds lighter than the R-2000, it's likely that most of the improved performance was due to an incrementally better power-to-weight ratio related to the 1,600-pound total engine weight savings. This presumably overcame the very slight horsepower deficit compared to the standard R-2000. Otherwise, there was not much advantage. If any viewers out there have information or photos regarding this rare and unusual DC-4 variant, I'd like to read your comments and or corrections in the comment section, or just go ahead and email me. Now, I'll summarize the 2 other larger transports that utilize the 9 Series engine in chronological order of their introductions, starting with the Grumman HU-16 Albatross. This was a military amphibian with the primary purpose of open ocean search and rescue, SAR, water rescue. It could handle 4-foot swells with detachable jet-assisted takeoff, or JATO, rocket bottles, which were required for takeoff in higher swells. Its first flight was in October 1947, and 466 copies were produced by Grumman over the 12-year period from 1949 to 1961. The initial primary operators were the U.S. Navy, the United States Air Force, the United States Coast Guard, the Royal Canadian Air Force, the Hellenic Greek Navy, and ultimately with many other non-U.S. militaries. During its lifetime, the plane operated under several designations, but were mostly using its SA-16 designation or its final designation as the HU-16 as of 1962. The prototype was designated the G-64 or XJR-2F-1 Pelican, both a cumbersome and ugly name. Then there were other designations for other test aircraft until the production designation was later finalized as the SA-16A Albatross, which had a much shorter wingspan than the follow-on conversion to the SA-16B. Most Albatross were powered by the 1,425 horsepower Curtiss-Wright R-1820 76A or B 9 Series engines, which is one of the lowest horsepower ratings for this engine, with a uniquely high 0.666 to 1 propeller gear ratio. So the propeller disc itself was of a relatively small 11-foot diameter compared to the more normal 11-foot 6-inch diameter props for the more common lower geared engine used on all other aircraft applications for this engine. This smaller, faster spinning propeller made the engine seem like it was turning at higher RPMs than the normally lower geared 9 Series engines, but engine RPM ranges remained the same for all propeller gear ratios. This gearing and propeller arrangement made the Albatross sound more like a small Beechcraft Model 18 rather than the deeper sounds with all other aircraft using the lower geared engines. The original short-spanned SA-16A had a wingspan of 80 feet 0 inches, but all eventually went through a conversion process to the SA-16B, with the span increased to 96 feet 8 inches like this one. The HU-16B, as designated in 1962, normally had a crew of 4 to 6 personnel and could carry up to 10 or more passengers. Typically, empty weight was 23,025 pounds and maximum takeoff weight was 37,500 pounds off land, but limited to 34,000 pounds off water using JATO. Maximum speed was 235 miles an hour and a cruise speed of 125 miles an hour was typical. The service ceiling was 23,800 feet and normal range was around 1,450 miles, or an extended range of 2,260 miles with 2 300-gallon drop tanks. The plane was heavily used in the SAR role in both the Korean and Vietnam Wars, as well as in the South Pacific and Caribbean. Many were utilized as general transport hacks. When turned over to the Air National Guards and the Air Force Reserves, they were used for covert insertions and extractions in multiple conflict zones worldwide from around 1957 to 1971. The United States Air Force retired their HU-16Bs in 1973, with the U.S. Navy and U.S. Coast Guard not following suit until 1983. But the last one in military service was retired much later in 1995 by the Greek Hellenic Navy. However, many found their way into civilian and commercial operations in the meantime. Air Micronesia operated commercial conversions in airline service until 1970, when island runways were expanded for larger land planes. Other Albatross were later modified as G-111s for commercial airline use with Chalk's Airways between Florida and the Bahamas. Chalk's was shut down in 2007 after a fatal crash of one of their Frakes turbo-mallard amphibians off the Florida coast in late 2005. Most of the 13 Chalk's G-111s were sent to Arizona for storage, but some found their way into private hands. Several have been restored back to military or semi-military configurations, flying the airshow circuits, and others have been highly modified by so-called one-percenters as amphibious RVs that are also still flying. And wouldn't anyone want to have one of those? Sticking with our rough chronological order, the next large 9 Series powered aircraft was best known as the Douglas Super DC-3S airliner, or the C-117D in its military configuration. As a remanufactured aircraft from existing standard airframes, this was a roughly 60% rework of the standard Douglas DC-3 or C-47, and was first flown in June 1949, receiving its CAA type certificate over a year later in July 1950. Because at the time Douglas was focusing on long-haul 4-engine airline transports, it didn't have the resources to focus on twin-engine short and medium-haul planes like the Convair liners and Martin liners. The problem was that starting in 1947, the U.S. Civil Air Authorities began pushing legislation to ban DC-3s in airline service due to poor single-engine outperformance, as well as for its sometimes quirky stability and takeoff performance. Hence, the low-hanging fruit for Douglas was to inexpensively remanufacture DC-3s and C-47s in a new configuration that met all the new proposed performance requirements that the newer Convair 240s and Martin 202s had met. The result was the commercial DC-3S, a remanufactured DC-3 with slightly greater wing sweep, slightly shorter wingspan from 95 to 90 feet with squared-off tips, and larger and squared-off tail surfaces. The fuselage was stretched by 39 inches forward of the wing, along with bulkhead changes. These improvements increased passenger capacity from the standard 21 passengers to around 34 or 35. The 3S had fully enclosed landing gear when retracted, and brand new commercial 9 Series R-1820 961 C9HE engines, developing 1,475 horsepower compared to the 1,200 horsepower with the standard R-1830 or R-1820 powered standard DC-3. The 961 C9HE engine had the standard 0.5625 to 1 propeller gear ratio using larger diameter 11-foot 6-inch propellers that all 9 Series aircraft applications used, except for the HU-16 Albatross amphibian as just described. Just for fun, let's compare the Super DC-3's 1,475 horsepower 9 Series cowling installations on the left with that of the basic DC-3s that used the baseline World War II R-1820 engine of 1,200 horsepower on the right, many of which remained in service for decades after the war. You can see that the more powerful 9 Series installation on the left required larger cowl flaps for cooling, among other design changes. Other improvements to the airframe included flush riveting on the new outer wing panels and other areas to decrease drag, improved hydraulics and other ancillary systems, and other modifications. These modifications fully solved the performance and stability shortfalls of the standard DC-3 outlined above. However, there was continued pressure from the smaller airlines that had no choice but to rely on surplus converted C-47s. The federal government thought these underfunded local service feeders were critical to public convenience and necessity, so the proposed new airworthiness requirements were permanently withdrawn in 1953, as the newer twins such as the Martins and Convair airliners were meeting these standards and more anyway. Compared to the standard DC-3, the Super DC-3S maximum speed was increased from 230 miles per hour to 270 miles per hour. Cruise speed went from 207 miles per hour to 251 miles per hour. Initial rate of climb went from 1,130 feet per minute to 1,300 feet per minute. And fuel efficiency was improved, in addition to the improved passenger capacity. Still, the capacity and performance of the Super DC-3S fell into a donut hole of sorts. They were not on par with the Martin and Convair liner short-haul twins that the larger airlines could afford, and too much for the DC-3 operators who could not afford the Super DC-3. That aside, one airline, short-hauler Capital Airlines, ordered and flew 3 DC-3Ss, but only for 2 years. In airline service, the advanced high-powered C9HE engines could not acclimate to the intense daily short-cycle airline operations of Capital, a local service high-cycle airline. Their engines developed valve warpage and failure, among other heat and vibration-related problems that badly cut down time before overhaul times. So, despite the favorable impressions of both Capital Airlines crews and passengers alike, management and mechanics hated them. Accordingly, the 3 planes were sold to a corporate customer who, by its nature, did not have endless, tight flying schedules. So, no other Super DC-3Ss were sold to commercial airlines. But it was only the end of the plane's first commercial service era. It entered into a second commercial era in years later, as we shall see. As luck would have it, the U.S. Navy developed a keen interest in the plane and had 98 of their stock C-47s converted to Super DC-3 status per military specifications, first designating it R-4D8 until 1962, when it was redesignated the C-117D. Its interior was largely interchangeable for standard passengers, VIP service, troops, medevac, and pure cargo operations entering U.S. Navy service in 1950 or 1951. Many of the Navy aircraft were allocated to the U.S. Marines. These military planes were powered by minor variations of the 9 series known as the R-1820-80 series, which was the military designation of the commercial C-9HE. Some C-117Ds were configured as navigational trainers and in Vietnam for electronic surveillance flights. Empty weight for the C-117D was 19,537 pounds, with maximum takeoff weight of 31,000 pounds versus 25,000 pounds for the stock DC-3. And, of course, passenger capacity was increased. The U.S. Navy and Marines used them in the Korean and Vietnam Wars, and over all its military service decades, they were extensively stationed at U.S. and overseas bases in all varieties of roles, mainly as transports and airbase hacks. The Navy retired their C-117Ds during the 1970s, and the U.S. Marines retired their last one as late as 1992. As the Navy and Marines retired them, many fell back into commercial service again, this time in freighter and some charter passenger roles. A handful have been operating recently in both passenger and freight service in Alaska and South America, but probably not for long. One summer in the mid-1980s, I would see one of them, a freighter, on scheduled daily early morning flights, slowly cruising east along Victor Airways 88 over St. Louis as the sun just rose above the horizon. The engines seemed to reverberate more than the smoother-running baseline R-1820s on the standard DC-3s, as we've been mentioning all along. Still, the sound of that well-worn airplane overhead calmed my nerves and recharged me while in the middle of putting on my tie to start another hectic workday. The last one I saw flew over my house in 1992. That one was based at St. Louis Lambert International Airport for a very short time, only to just as quickly disappear forever. Long after my last C-117D sightings in St. Louis, at least one Aerodinosaur subscriber has had first-hand experience with a civilianized C-117D freighter in the early 2000s. Nick Vogue was a hardcore freight dog serving the Hawaiian island chain as pilot with Kamaka Air, and he remains proud of it. Usually, in this Fleet Beach 18, he and his other crew members flew just about every category of loose mixed cargo, day and night, through all kinds of weather, while enduring the normal plethora of surprise in-flight mechanical issues associated with old piston freighters. But Nick also got to regularly fly the right seat in this Kamaka Air C-117D, November 9796 November, but cargo patterns between the Hawaiian Islands dictated that they only flew the Super DC-3S once or twice per month at most. It sure sounds like the life to me, but Nick has some harrowing stories similar to what almost every freight dog piston pounder has experienced in one form or another. That said, he wouldn't trade his piston flying experience for anything in the world, but he was still relieved when the reliable turboprop Cessna Caravan freighters entered the fleet. Nick says that C-117D 96 November was a low-time airframe in good condition, but was abandoned in 2011 and has been rotting away on a Hawaiian airport tarmac ever since. Speaking of its vibration and reverberating sound, I'd like to refer back to the 9 Series overheating and valve problems that Capital Airlines experienced, which may not have been caused solely by high cycle operations. This is because the military, too, was plagued by a higher frequency of similar problems with this high-powered engine in their trainers, carrier-borne surveillance aircraft, and helicopters, to be covered in the next episode. These problems were apparently never fully solved, and I hypothesize that the cylinder head cooling fin design was a major culprit. While that could have contributed to the overheating exhaust valves and other overheating issues, was it possible that this engine also suffered excessive vibration levels out of its 9 jumbo-sized long-stroke cylinders? My experience is that the engine seemed to be a rough runner compared to the baseline World War II R-1820, but both had the same 6.9-inch long stroke, longer than any US-built heavy piston radial, so it must be something else. Was the 9 Series first and second order vibration dampening not effective enough, and with engineering constraints, was it impossible to improve the dampening on this engine? These considerations may help explain why more powerful 9-cylinder radials were never built. Now, I was never an aerospace engineer or airframe and power plant mechanic, so I'm in a poor position to second guess what Curtiss-Wright engineers were thinking nearly 80 years ago when the 9 Series engine emerged, or the limitations they may have faced in designing and manufacturing that more powerful R-1820. However, for many years, I did work as an industrial sales engineer, sizing, service factoring, and selling virtually every type of bearing, industrial mechanical, and electromechanical power transmission equipment and lubricants. This includes electric motors from fractional horsepower to up to 5,000 horsepower that you'd see in steel mills, and large gear reducers, basically huge industrial transmissions, shafting and shaft couplings, etc. So I can claim a basic but practical experience in the areas of horsepower, torque, metallurgy, thermodynamics, and service factoring. In addition, I've studied the basics of heavy radial engine design for well over the past 50 years and have published articles on that in aviation magazines and have written a book on heavy radial topics. So, I've got theories on the design of the 9 Series engine that you, the viewers, are free to constructively comment, correct, or constructively tear down. I think inadequate cooling fin design, especially around the exhaust port area at the top of the head, was a key contributor to the exhaust valve failures, and poor vibration dampening may have contributed to this and other failures. The finning issue becomes more apparent when comparing the post-war 9 Series R-1820 cylinder head on the left to the rear row post-war CA Series R-3350 head on the right, the latter of which was used in the later model R-3350s, including the turbo-compound engine used on military aircraft and large airliners. Both cylinders have the same 6.125-inch bore size. However, the stroke dimension of the 9 Series R-1820 engine is a long stroke of 6.9 inches, as we mentioned, versus 6.3 inches for the R-3350. The long stroke may have also contributed to vibration levels for all R-1820 versions. It's important to note that 175 maximum horsepower was demanded from each 9 Series cylinder on the left, with only 156 horsepower demanded from each advanced R-3350 cylinder on the right. I cannot overemphasize that 175 horsepower represented the highest specific output demanded out of any widely used heavy radial engine, including engines of substantially greater total horsepower than the 9 Series engine. Accordingly, the 9 Series generated the most excess heat and stress on the cylinder and exhaust valves, but the finning over the hottest exhaust port area was not enhanced, as you see, unlike all other engines. Notice the Postwar C-Series R-2800 head on the left, as well as the R-4360 head on the right, both featured enhanced finning around the exhaust valve area as well. The later C-Series R-2800 demanded only 139 horsepower from each cylinder, and the most powerful R-4360s, with the highest heavy radial horsepower ratings of 3,800 horsepower, demanded only 136 horsepower from each cylinder. Again, compared to 175 horsepower demanded from the modestly finned post-war 9 Series 1820. Now, once again, let's compare the same baseline cast head World War II R-1820 cylinder on the left with the post-war forged and cut 9 Series R-1820 cylinder head on the right. Neither appeared to feature enhanced cooling finning around the exhaust port and valve. The baseline World War II engine was more reliable than the post-war 9 Series, however, probably because it was asked to develop only 133 horsepower per cylinder, in line with all other post-war radials ever built. And the more primitive cast head could seem to handle that. Again, I welcome viewer feedback on why the baseline World War II engine seemed to run smoother and more reliably than the post-war 9 Series. Was it vibration dampening? Listen to the difference. Now, some of you may scold me by saying that the sound differences may have more to do with the exhaust system configurations than anything else. Most baseline World War II era R-1820s used an exhaust collector ring method for all 9 cylinders, which was the case with the standard DC-3s. This tends to muffle the engine noise, whereas most 9 Series applications utilized something closer to an open stack system. However, the exhaust system in most 9 Series engines cannot be considered a true short open stack system, as the 9 Series exhaust system usually involved 3 separate collector rings serving perhaps 3 cylinder each or some other combination. At the same time, I must acknowledge that the method of exhaust collection and expulsion can cause variations in engine sound signatures. And the turbocharging of the B-17 muffled the sound of the baseline World War II engine even more. These are my personal observations, which may be too simplistic or possibly incorrect. So I urge viewers who have been directly involved with one or both R-1820 engine variants to comment and or correct me on this. So, when people tell you that the HU-16 Albatross, the Super DC-3S, or the other planes we'll cover in the next episode 6 were all powered by the B-17 engine, politely explain that this is not entirely true. It may be an engine of the same manufacturer, configuration, and displacement, but still a very different engine that was not interchangeable with the original. Thanks for watching, and see you in episode 6. Aerodinosaur is proud to introduce a new propliner book by me, John Andrew Reed, now available on Amazon.com, entitled Second Wind of the Aerial Leviathans. This book is 388 pages long and features 64 full narrative chapters with over 280 black and white photographs, complete with detailed captions. The bulk of the story and most of the photographs have never been published before. All this for only $24.95. Second Wind of the Aerial Leviathans helps the reader make sense of a perplexing era in North American aviation. The chapters are in chronological order, beginning in the early 1960s, consisting of first- and second-hand stories about obsolete propliner, passenger, and freight operations that continued long after the dawn of the jetliner age, well past their technological prime and intended use into the early 2000s. If you like stories about the overextended use of DC-6s, DC-7s, Lockheed Constellations and Electras, Martin 404s, Convair liners, and Curtiss C-46s, and the unique personalities that flew them, this is where you will find it all. The stories behind many of our Aerodinosaur videos on this channel are found in this book. The reader will experience this era through my own experiences and through the eyes of some of the key people who operated and flew propliners during this time period, mainly out of St. Louis, Kansas City, Detroit, and the infamous Corrosion Corner at Miami International Airport, flying passengers, general freight, automotive freight, and overnight courier freight. You'll experience the prevalence of lax air regulations during that time and the resultant operator corner cutting that caused both high and low profile propliner disasters involving sports celebrities and teams, rock stars, and freight dog crews. You will also learn how one of the rare legitimate operators of old propliners, who had the largest DC-6 fleet in the world during this era, impacted airline deregulation after 1978 and changed the airline industry forever. We delve equally into the technical and historical details of the airplanes and unravel this otherwise confusing era. I could go on forever about what is packed into this book, but instead of more of that, check out Second Wind of the Aerial Leviathans for only $24.95 at Amazon.com.